This is DMG's Bootstraps in Business. I'm Savannah Jones, and today I'm talking with James Kelley, PhD. No doubt about it, we have all faced a lot of challenges over the last year with the pandemic, and he knows all about change and adversity and how to make it work for you. He's an author, podcaster, and entrepreneur, currently CEO, COB, and co-founder of Qchange, your digital meeting coach. So leaders and teams are better in meetings. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. I mentioned that, I'm talking to business leaders and thought leaders and, and you've accomplished so much and lived all over the world and done so many things. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a great conversation. Then I Google you and I'm like, oh, well, that could be like, we could be here for days because you have had such an interesting journey and such an interesting life. And, when you and I talked previously, you brought up, your background and your family right away. And from everything I've seen and everything I read, I mean, you're very forthright about, when you're discussing adversity. I mean, you're right in there with everybody else.
Yeah, for sure. I think that often people are ashamed of their adversity because they feel like that adversity ends up defining them. But I feel like it depends on how you want to frame that definition of the adversity. So I've always been an open book to the faults. Mary, my wife, she's learned to appreciate the fact that I'm an open book. And there are things that my kids will find out about me through my podcasts I've done or my book and stuff like that. None of it's shameful and it's all momentary. So I never look at anything negative. So I appreciate that comment, I think is what I'm trying to get to.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your background a little bit and then kind of, your globetrotting years. And yes, author, podcaster, entrepreneur. So the list goes on and on. But how did it all start? I mean,
well, you didn't throw handsome in there. I mean, for goodness, I'm just totally kidding. Gosh, you're right. This could be a really long podcast. I often joke, and I think in our pre-call I joked about this, that I was raised in a family that was Catholic in philosophy, without the Catholicism, a touch of violence, and a whole lot of guilt. And I was the youngest by 5 years, and I had 2 half brothers and an adopted brother in there. So I kind of already grew up in a somewhat blended family growing up. And so in some ways, that was a blessing. But I think more importantly, my upbringing, my values, I'd love to say they stem from my mom and my dad, and they did instill some really good things. But there was a family I spent almost every summer with from probably 10 years old on until maybe middle of high school. And I would spend every day in the summer there. And I learned so many values about human beings and caring and compassion and helping. And they were Hispanic and their friends were all Native Americans. And so I was in this world and ecosystem that was kind of other for 3 months a year, 2.5 months a year. And, you don't know at the time what a gift that is, but boy, that was such a gift to be around that, to understand what tolerance is and perspective is and a different way of communicating. As I said, I grew up in a house that's the loudest and meanest person won. That was the argument. So if you could be mean, you win, I was like, yay. Now the shame and anger, the other side of it wasn't always healthy, but I'd go to their house and I would say, oh, wow, like you can talk to a human being and have a disagreement and not yell. And, so anyhow, I mean, that's kind of the I guess, core of my upbringing was that experience.
And then how did leaving the house, leaving your home and then moving into like your first job? So at home, your parents did the best they could, but spending time with your friends' parents and their family kind of opened your eyes to, well, not everything is exactly like it is in my household. And I can probably venture out of this circle. And then what did that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there was, such an interesting question. my parents' philosophy about college was just try. Not wasn't like go or not go. It was just try. And it was almost pleading to try. And when I went to university, my dad for many years refused to take a promotion so that we didn't have to move. So he really sacrificed his career, which I was always a hand up right away. Hey, let's move, let's go. And he's like, no, you're in high school. I don't want to do that to you. But so when I went to university, I went from Portland, Oregon to the Midwest. And at the same time, my parents moved from Portland to Chicago. So everything was just new from that point on. And that was the first time I'd ever left my house in 17 years was when I went to college. And this example has been true for literally every move I've ever made and every decision. I didn't visit the school before I went there. I had about 4 conversations. I played sports in college, and I had about 4 conversations with the coaches, and I said yes. And they said, you know where it's at? I'm like, yeah, Daytona. And I was like, and they're like, no, Dayton. Oh, okay. So like, I didn't make the connection. I was just so excited to go, fly the coop, if you will. And so from 17 on, every major decision like that, getting my PhD, moving to cities, taking jobs, I never visited the city before. I just would make a decision and deal, I guess you will.
So do you think, does that make you a risk taker or?
Yeah.
What's the other side of that?
Yeah. I feel like that's a loaded question to yes pretty quick. So, we can get to the entrepreneur side in a little bit, but I definitely am not risk adverse. That is not in my DNA because I think part of it, and that's the entrepreneurial side of me, but I think the lack of fear of failure, not that there isn't any, but it's not a dominating, psychology in my brain around if I fail. It's just, I don't care if I fail because I failed so often as a child and as a high school student and as an athlete that like failure isn't the end all be all. So for me, super low, like risk is whatever, I'll do it. It doesn't really bother me.
Well, so you haven't always been fearless, have you? I mean,
well, there's degrees of fearlessness. So growing up, I did BMX biking, all this stuff. Yeah, I had fear there. Like there's jumps I wouldn't do and where my friends would do it because I was afraid of the pain on the other side of crashing. But that was the physical pain. But from an emotional standpoint, boy, I'm sure there are examples I'm not thinking of. But overall, from a very young age, in fact, I remember my grandma, I quit college after my freshman year. And since I know you're in Portland, you'll appreciate this. I actually quit and I started selling cars at Ron Tonkin Chevrolet.
Oh, right.
So I left college in Dayton, Ohio, moved back to Portland, and my parents were in Chicago, but I was living with my grandma at the time. And my grandma said to me one day, she was like, you know what? I don't worry about you. You're super resilient. I worry about your cousins, but I don't worry about you. And so I think that there's always been that sense about me that I'm super resilient. I can deal with kind of whatever's taken and thrown at me. And so from a non-physical perspective, I'm pretty fearless. Some mistaken that for confidence, but I wouldn't say, I mean, maybe it is confidence, but I think of it more as, what do you have to lose, I guess.
Right. And resilience. I mean, you said it, you're Teflon.
Well, so it's saying stick. You go back in my history, there's some stuff that has definitely stuck. But when I was thinking about it, it's more about my curiosity of the experience than it probably is anything else.
What did you do after you sold cars? So you
dropped out of
college and then sold cars.
I did that for a year. And this is a great story. I remember I was, it was a fun job. I was 19. Like I remember in like December, I don't know what year it was. I got salesperson of the month, and here I am, this 19-year-old, like I'm crushing it. I think I made $36,000 for the year. Like, and at 19, that's pretty good back in like 94, 95, something like that. And, but I remember we had this used car shack in the back of the facility. And I remember going in there and there were 2 guys, and I'm sure it's totally changed. So this is over 30 years ago almost. I walked in and 2 guys had rolled up dollar bills and were doing lines of Coke. and I walked in and said, "Hey, do you want to do some?" And I'm telling you, it was like every single movie you've ever seen where there's a vision quest forward and there are choice points. And one was me in an orange jumpsuit and one was me going back to college. And I said, no. I turned around, walked into the lobby, called my mom and said, I want to go back to college next year. And she was just like, okay. And they just figured out how to make it happen. You know, they're like, all right, you're going. They're like, we're jumping at this. If he says he's going, we're jumping. And so I ended up going back to college in 95, 96, something like that. And, you know, I think that the next major adversity is my dad died going into my last year of college. And he died at 49 from congestive heart failure. And they had moved from Chicago to Atlanta. And so, you know, they had just moved there and he got sick and then he passed away there shortly after, probably within 5 months, 6 months. So it was really fast. And, you know, even to this day, you know, we're, I think over 25 years since he's passed away, I still can get emotional thinking about it. I can still cry, definitely get tears in my eyes, because I think, you know, as a young man, part of your journey from child to adulthood is that almost mending of that relationship with your father, going from parent-child to really friends. And we were going through that process. You could feel it happening for him. He was opening up more to me as a human and vice versa. And so, you know, that was ripped away from me, which was really obviously difficult, you know, as a young man. So I didn't do so well my last year of college. I drank way more than most of whatever else I could do. But that was my way of coping through that time. Right or wrong as it is, that was just my method to do it for myself. So, and you graduated college and, you know, wherever you want to go next, the conversation, but it's a very long story. So we can skip to new events if you like.
Well, let's talk about I definitely want to talk about the globetrotting. So let's kind of just jump on that, because back to your original point of, you know, packing up and making moves. We absolutely have got to talk about some of the places that you moved and how that happened.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll try to be as to the point as I can be. As I said earlier, curiosity has driven everything for me. I want to have an experience. I've been fairly without much funds for most of my life, whether paycheck to paycheck, whatever. But I've always been excited about having the experience that you can have on the other side of that. So most people vacation. I couldn't afford vacations. I could just move. So that was my trade-off. I couldn't afford the vacation to Bahamas, but I'll sure move to New York for 2 years, because why not, you know, without visiting. And so after college, I moved to Chicago for about 10 months, and I lived about a block from Wrigley Field, which was amazing. Could hear the roar of the crowd. And it was like the Blues Brothers, where we lived right on the train track. So as the train came by, volume up, train went away, volume down. And it just became like you knew the rhythm of it. So you just, hand was on the remote, up, down, up, down. And so that was an amazing, but I was so dirt poor. I remember one time my roommate and I, we for 3 weeks ate refried beans, instant mashed potatoes, and tortillas, because that's all we could afford.
All the food groups.
Yeah. We really nailed them all. We would scrap through the couches to get the $1.50 hamburger around the corner, like once every 2 to 3 weeks. We were so excited about that. So I was definitely the poor post-college student. I was poor in college. I had 3 jobs at one point, but I was definitely poor out of college. And at the time, I somehow stumbled into a master's program for media management, which was to be a film producer. And I left that. And, you know, I moved back to Portland because my mom had moved from Atlanta to Portland, and she had lost her job doing mortgage underwriting and things like that. And so I felt a little bit of obligation to go help her. But the honest truth was I didn't want to do the college. I didn't want to do a master's program. I didn't know what I was doing. It wasn't particularly hard, but it just wasn't something that I was interested in. I don't think I was ready for it. So I moved back. I took a job, and I was there for 12 or 18 months, maybe a little bit less than that. Had a huge burnout moment. I remember I was sitting at my desk. I was working for this company, opening up their 41st office of this national chain, grossly underqualified, and I grossly oversold my abilities before I took the job. Horribly.
You recommend that?
Yeah. if you're a glutton for punishment. Yeah, that's about it. I think I learned a very valuable lesson at that point. And about 10 months in, I remember sitting at my desk and my assistant came in and I was white and I was crying and I was shaking. And she was like, "Are you all right?" I go, "I don't think so. Like, I actually don't think I'm all right." And I ended up leaving that job shortly after, taking another job in the same industry in San Jose. Got fired 4 months in. This is another great story. So I was, do you remember back in like the early 2000s, right after the .com, I thought the world was going to die,
Right.
but you would get emails sent to you and you were like, it would say like, click here to learn X or whatever. And you weren't supposed to do it. Like, but like you were so curious, like, it's a really good clickbait. And it was before the antiviruses were really good. And
Right.
so I clicked it and I shut down 18 of the 20 offices in the network for this company.
Oh.
and I was fired 4 days later. So
surprise.
I know. Okay. All right. And so anyhow, but that was great. So I ended up losing the job, living in San Jose for the summer. I call it the summer of James. So if you've ever seen Seinfeld, the summer of George, it was totally the summer of James, where, believe it or not, I grew my hair out down to my shoulders, had a beard about this big, super tan. I worked at a pool teaching kids to swim and painted walls. And like, that's all I did for like 4 months. And you would have thought I smoked a pound of pot when I would drive down the highway, because I would just go real slow, like 65, wave at everybody, take my horns, giving me the middle finger, get going. I'm like, it's all right, dude. Like, I was so relaxed. I long for that day at this point in my life. But I go from there and I moved to then New York to get my MBA. So I go there. And then the global trotting really started. I thought I was going to be a water polo coach. Did not happen. I got fired again. That was my second big failure in life. I got fired. I blew up, and it's a longer story. I ended up getting fired because I was being a jerk. Totally deserved it when I went and spoke to the AD, and it was like the athletic director, the associate directors, and they all looked at me and they said, "Well, what do you think you did?" I'm like, "Oh, I was wrong. You should fire me." And they're like, "Okay, you're fired." I'm like, "Okay, thanks." Like, so I think that level of ownership is really important too. So I owned my mistakes. I've owned all my mistakes. I don't believe in projecting it out to other people. I think everyone needs to be accountable to their own stuff. So in that moment though, I was able to finish my MBA before I got officially fired from that job I was coaching. And I had taken a team to Australia, and the first time I ever traveled abroad. And this is where the global bug really hit. And so I was 28, 29. And I moved to Japan after that. And so I moved to Japan, I moved to Tokyo, and I remember getting off the airplane, not reading the language, not knowing what toilets were what, knowing the toilets were totally different than the US toilets. It was a squat one, not a normal like we were used to in the Western world. And I remember going to the grocery or the convenience store and just walking around trying to figure out what's safe for me to eat. And I remember going to the milk aisle and not knowing which white milk was actually milk. Like, I had no idea. And I'm like, all right, I got some cereal. I know what Cheerios looks like. I can handle that one. And I grabbed the milk. And to this day, I don't know what I drank, but it definitely was not milk. Like, I had no idea. So I spent a year in Japan, came back, moved to Vancouver, Washington, Portland, Oregon. But at that same time, I think in your life, Savannah, answer me this. Have you had like those quintessential moments that were defining for you in terms of what happened next?
Right. I was in Minneapolis, lost a job, got hired by an international company, ended up in Boston, and ended up traveling all over the world and living in Toronto.
Yeah.
Because I got
And so did you find in that moment, like,
fired from a job and said yes to and I also oversold myself, and could not handle I had two positions. One was sort of an HR position, one was an admin position. HR, yeah, I got that handled. Admin, and the president of the company was like, we're gonna have to let her go. She didn't know what she's doing.
Yeah.
And the vice president said, well, she knows the other side. So they had to hire somebody in for admin, and I took over HR, and
Yeah.
the rest is history. But yes.
Yes.
So the answer is that's a long yes.
Yeah. So when I was living, and when I came back from Japan, I also applied for the Peace Corps. And so I was like, I'm going to do the Peace Corps. That will be really fun. And so I went to a Peace Corps event, down at Portland State University. And afterwards, the woman who was hosting the event said, "Hey, I have some friends coming from PSU who are getting their PhDs. Do you want to hang out and have a drink?" I'm like, yeah. And these guys were all from Africa. And at the time, I was really involved in reading a ton of The Economist, which is just great from a global perspective. And I'm holding this conversation with these PhD students who, in my head, I always thought were these untouchable intellects of the world, right? And for me, that was the most defining conversation I've ever had in my whole entire life. That has absolutely changed my trajectory of my life. I walked away going, I could do this. Like, I could go get my PhD. Now, for the audience, I had a 2.5 coming out of high school, 2.5 GPA, and a 2.4 coming out of college. I was not what you would think as a studious student, but at my MBA, because it was practical, I got a 3.5. So I saw oh wait, maybe I'm not that dumb. Maybe I do have some intellect. So I ended up declining the Peace Corps and going to get my PhD in Perth, Australia. And so again, never visited, hopped on an airplane, 20 some hours later. And I remember waking up the next morning after I got there, and I went for a run, and I was in utter panic mode. I mean, I'm going to cry. What am I doing? I'm so stupid. I don't belong here. I'm out of my depth. I mean, every negative connotation you could think of, I was saying all of it. And I went for a run, and I started heading up this hill called, I can't remember, Sterling Highway. And you crest the top of Sterling Highway, and you get to the top, you literally can see the Indian Ocean. And I got to the top, and I remember this so vividly. I started to walk at the very tip of that. I was just so angry and like frustrated and scared, really. And I like looked up. I was like, "What am I doing?" Air hit me in the face, and I looked down, and I could see the Indian Ocean. And I just started running towards the ocean, and it was the most cathartic. Like, you could feel the 12 pianos on my back just being shed one by one by one. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like I am meant to be here at this point in this moment to do this thing. And so I spent the next 3.5, 4 years in Perth, and what an incredible place to be. I'd recommend anyone to go there, even for vacation. After that, I moved to Philadelphia. So then I went to Philadelphia for 7 years, taught at a university there. I ended up getting my PhD in consumer psychology. And while I was doing that, though, I kept starting little businesses on the side, trying to consult, I had this big retail marketing plan I came up with to do a retail store. And while I'm doing that, my wife and I are procreating like rabbits. So we're like up to 3 kids by my 6th year at St. Joe's University. We had our 4th kid by the time I quit there. And then because I lived around the world and my wife was American but moved to Perth, it became very clear to us that one of the fundamental gifts we could give our kids is to live someplace other than America, to be a minority someplace outside of your own culture. And so we ended up moving to a little city called Al-Ain, which is just outside Dubai in the United Arab Emirates University. And when I say like a little city, it might have been like 300,000, but I mean, there were camels everywhere, goats in cars. We could see Oman from our border. Not Russia from Alaska type of thing, but like literally you could see Oman from the border. And we spent 4 years there. I was teaching, I was still starting businesses, and that's when I wrote my book. And during that time, I'd started a podcast. I did a podcast for 3 years called Executive After Hours. And that was a really fun journey, because the people like you who would have people like me who love to hear themselves talk come on and just yak for 30 to 50 minutes and you're just listening, right? And
I've got the easy part.
Yeah. And so I did that for 3 years, and I interviewed about 150 executives from, a chief strategy officer at Google X all the way down to entrepreneurs and everything else in between. And that was really the material for the book that I wrote, which was about crucibles. And so when I interviewed all these leaders, I was very curious about their journey. And I'd always kind of push and prod and poke and pull information out of them that I don't think they would have otherwise have shared, because it required them to be vulnerable. And so I would find out about people who had siblings, had their own children die when they were, parents, or had a parent die when they were a child, or they had drug abuse at some point, whatever. Like, you would get these stories out, and I started looking for trends around who are these people today? What were they like then? What was the pivotal points? And so the book is called The Crucible's Gift: 5 Lessons from Authentic Leaders That Thrive in Adversity. And really what it came down to is I realized that leaders that were really authentic were the ones who embraced and grew from their crucibles or their adversity moments. I think they're really, first of all, I hate the term black and white. So I think this world is full of shades of gray. But what I found is that people who were more open and vulnerable to their adversity were better and more able to grow and be more compassionate, live with more integrity, and really value the relationships. And all that was driven by curiosity and self-awareness. And then, we fast forward a little bit more. I left academia, started my job now as the CEO of Qchange. And now I am privileged to be talking to you at this point, Savannah. I think I've jumped a bunch of things, but I think I got us up to date.
Yes. Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about your podcast. And you and I talked a little bit about that, but what did your, like, a real day look like while you were doing your podcast? And when you started your podcast, was the book in mind, or did that just evolve along the way?
Yeah. So great question. Let me break that down. The podcast, when I started in the US, was really straightforward. I would do interviews in the afternoon or sometimes at night. Being an academic at that time, I had a load of flexibility. So I could just schedule it at 1 o'clock if I didn't have a class, or 2 o'clock. So it's very easy for me to fit it in. What I found is that as I had more interviews and my time started to get busier, the quality of my guests that I wanted, not that they weren't good or bad, wasn't what I was trying to attain. And so I became less interested in the process. And so the quality of the guest matters 1,000% in a podcast. It's like a good radio interview or whatever, like the guest makes everything. But when I moved to the UAE, it was just incredibly hectic. And so, I was doing interviews at 9, 10, 11, 12 at night. My wife is a triathlon coach, so it means I have to be physically active. So I was getting up at like 5 and 6 in the morning, and, I was teaching, I was trying to start Qchange. And so it was just too much. And then living in the UAE at the time, Zooms were blocked. Skype wasn't working. It was all blocked by their government. So then you had to use a VPN. VPN wouldn't always work. So it just kept getting more and more complicated. And then really the biggest thing is someone who comes from like understanding radio and why sound is so important.
Right.
All of the ceilings are like 12 feet tall, made of stone. And like the echo was so bad. I had to edit all of my own podcasts, and I would sit there for hours. Like, I cannot get rid of this echo. Oh my God, I couldn't take it. Anyhow. And so it was really crazy.
From the tomb.
What was that?
Interviews from the tomb.
Oh my God, totally from the tomb. That actually would be a great podcast, by the way. Interview from the tomb. Bit morbid. But the book, so this is really fascinating. So when I went to Australia to get my PhD, I got there and I spent a couple hours one day just writing my goals, right? And so I was 32 at the time, 31, 32. And I said, by 44, I had a list of them. I wrote, what did I write? I'm now 44 and I've now written my first book. So I write my goals as if I've done them. That's kind of how I just write them. Psychologically, it's good for your brain. It's a trigger. So what's funny is I only looked at those goals maybe one other time between then and 44. At 44, I wrote the book. And I never went back and looked at it. And I recently looked at the goals in the process of writing the book. And it was just so crazy to me that it was still in my head and I still accomplished that goal. And of the 10 goals I wrote on that day, I accomplished 8 of the 10, and I had not looked at the goals, but maybe one other time. And so that's where the book came from. The initial seed was planted, when I was 31 years old, and at 44, I wrote it. I wrote it in Portugal on the beach in Peniche, Portugal. We did a summer vacation there. And my kids would go to the beach and do surf camp every day. And I'd go to the coffee shop and basically work 10-hour days every day for 6 weeks to finish the first draft of the book. So, yeah.
So you and I talked a little bit about your book tour and what that entailed. So you have a beautiful time on the beach.
Yeah.
Your book. And then the work starts.
Yeah, for sure.
What
Yeah.
did that look like? Because this is
Not
we're
good.
talking about adversity, because that's
Yeah.
really a big topic of conversation with you, and a real interest point. So
Yeah. You know, what's funny is that I had lofty dreams that people wanted to hear what I wanted to say. And so while I was doing my podcast, I also, which I forgot to mention, was trying to promote my book. And so I was also then being guests on podcasts as well. So I was basically being a guest and interviewing different people, and it was just chaotic. And so long story short, I thought for sure if I started calling and emailing different bookstores and different venues that I would have a fully booked tour. And what happened is, one, I'm not a booking agent, so I have no relationships. Two, people just don't care. And three, I did have some stops. I had an event in Philadelphia, DC, Chicago, Montreal. And then when I got to Montreal and I couldn't get anyone else to care, I just gave up. So like, and I mean, I'm owning it because I'm a creature of patterns. And so it was like the third or fourth pattern of like, yeah, we promoted it. No one showed up. It's not that, and so I had one in Denver as well. And so, it was a bit of a bust, but what was tremendous about it, if you want to do the glasses half full, is that I crammed my family of 4 into a Ford Explorer. And we started in Philadelphia, and we went from Philadelphia to DC, to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Denver, to Calgary. Sorry, I said Montreal. Calgary. Can never say that word. Calgary. To Vancouver, to Portland, to Bend, Oregon, to Seattle, and then we flew back to the Middle East. And that was about 7,500 miles we did as a family in that 6-week time period, which was insane.
How fun and insane.
Yeah, it was at points not very fun. I got to be honest with you. Like I was like driving. The only saving grace is that we had the whole Harry Potter series on tape, and 3 of the 4 kids loved it. And so we would just put it on, and that's like 75,000 hours of audio content. And the kids would just listen to it. And I'm like, I actually like Harry Potter. So that worked out pretty well for me.
Well, I have not read the book, but I have obviously read some of the summaries, and it looks like a really great book. Adversity and just addressing. Well, you said it yourself. You asked so many people, really interesting, knowledgeable, experienced people, really in-depth questions, and got some really great answers and advice. Yeah. And so from what I've read, I feel like it's a book I would really enjoy, because in regards to adversity, and then when that fork in the road comes, and how do you get from here to there? It just it seems like a great, not self-help book, but a good, and maybe it is a self-help book. A book to help navigate through challenges, personal and professional.
Yeah, definitely. There, within the book, there's a lot of my personal story that's coupled with the stories of some of the better interviews. And the reason why I do that face like, is it self-help, is that it depends on the individual. So I've had people come to me and say, you know what, I really love this book because it made me appreciate when my daughter died when she was 12, what I went through, and this kind of put a framework around it. I've had people who, who it is? It's the people who've all had adversity who love the book. Those that haven't are like, nah. It's really interesting. But the self-help part, at the end of each chapter, there's some activities that you can do if you want. I think that's the business side of my brain of saying, if you're going to write a book, you got to give something, you got to give people something to do, because then it's so in my head. But here's the thing about adversity that I think, I hope that the audience gets, is that 1, it's inevitable, and 2, you have a choice. And what I mean by that is that you always have a choice to figure out if it's happening to you or for you. Often the to you is in the moment, but the for you is really based on reflection. And if you can get from the 2 to the 4, then from that point on, you're a much stronger individual. But if you're stuck in the 2, then you really are playing the victim role. And unfortunately, victimhood is debilitating for everybody around that victim. Now, I'm not saying not to have moments of sorrow, sadness. I've had family members steal $10,000 from me, my father dying. I've had my fair share of adversity, but I think where I've been fortunate, and this might be I have a really weird attribute. Weird is a strong term. I have a very bad memory for the past. Like I can't tell you. I don't think about it. I don't care about it. I just move forward. And that could be a product of that we're being raised in an Irish Catholic household with a touch of violence and a whole lot of guilt, where I just decided to leave a lot of stuff back behind me. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you're constantly going back to it happened to me, you're never evolving as an individual. You're kind of that stone stuck. And it's just not healthy. It's not healthy for anybody. You can't change what's happened. You can only change how you respond. Doesn't that sound like I had some good therapy at some point? When I said
that's why I said it sounds like, read the book and pick your path. I'm one of those square peg round hole. Like if I'm trying too hard, something's wrong here. That's so for me, we'll bump up against something. I'm like, square peg round hole. I see another way.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, even as a business owner, we literally had that discussion today, like, are we fighting against something that's so obvious that we should be going after? Like we keep hearing the same thing again and again about our solution. And we're like, oh, no. Oh, no. And then, my business partner and I are today, we're like, I wonder if we're just being stupid and arrogant and not like moving that aside and saying, this might be the fastest, easiest path for us to grow. Just embrace it.
Right. Well, again, that's always going to be something, right?
Yeah.
So what before we wrap it up, why don't you just tell me a little bit about what's going on with Qchange?
Yeah.
Is that because you said, all along the way you've, been looking for new opportunities and creating new opportunities, and it's been a lengthy journey and, plenty ahead, but what's going on now?
So Qchange, just for the audience, the simple way to think about it is that we're a software company, and our whole solution is really about guiding and growing leaders and their teams. Like that's the whole thing. But we do it around meetings. And the reason is that's where leaders show up and that's where team members show up. And so why not impact them where they see each other the most and where decisions are made? And so it's going really well. I think like any early age startup, there are challenges, there are hiccups, there are personalities in the mix, between different owners and stuff like. But it's always, for us at least, we always put the mission, vision, values of the company first before our own wants and egos. And that's just something we're kind of embedded. And so, we just got accepted to an incubator that we start in a few weeks. We've applied to another incubator that we're hoping to get into at the same time. We are having conversations with some of the largest global companies in the world about our solution. So it's all really good stuff. You talked about being risk adverse. I'll speak from my perspective. I myself, my family have put in $365,000 of our own money.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, again, part of my personality of not being afraid of risk, I don't have a plan B. So this has to work.
Right.
Or I'm screwed. Right. And so anyhow, so Qchange is going well. And I think when you're an entrepreneur, you have to have a level of optimism, even in the face of ugliness. And you always have to be trying to figure out where the opportunities lay in front. And you've got to have a short memory. And luckily I do. And that part's great. So yeah, it's going really well. And I think, people who have seen the product, who really love what we're trying to do. And I think that's the affirmation we need to keep going. If we were to show, Savannah, if you were to look at, I don't know, if you were to launch a business or do something and 25 people said it was really bad, at some point, you're probably going to listen to that. Now there's tons of stories of entrepreneurs who just ignored it and just kept going and their product was really successful. But majority of people, if they heard that their product and their solution and their process was awful, would probably stop or pivot. We fortunately have had very little pushback on any of the experts who look at it. I don't know if that's good or bad. But
good.
Yeah,
it's good for now.
Yeah, it's good for now. So anyhow, so everything's really good. Thank you for asking. It's been really fun. And, to do it at 46, to do it with 4 kids, my kids see what I'm doing every day, and to have a wife who's really incredibly supportive of this insanity, and some would say stupid choice in midlife to change careers like this. I'm very, very lucky to have Mary next to me. So, and my business partners each have really supportive wives as well, which is great.
Well, it sounds like from, an early age have been addressing and dealing with and making obvious choices in regards to adversity. And so it was a great conversation because as you and I had spoke about earlier, every single person has been touched by adversity over the last year because of the pandemic. So for people who were maybe thinking about moving up, becoming a leader, taking that next step, changing careers, whatever, a lot of people had their lives turned upside down with no choice, no option.
Yeah.
No, it's like, all right, well, this is what it was yesterday and here's what it is today. And guess what? I don't really have an option for tomorrow. So how do I figure this out? And what does this look like? Because of the uncertainty.
Yeah, there's so much.
So much. So I appreciate you're touching on it. And again, back to the book, it talks a lot about it. And for people who are going through it, and pretty much everybody is right now, I feel like it would be a really good read.
Yeah. Again, I've only got 16 reviews and 15 of the 16 are positive, like 5 out of 5. So, and here's the best part. The one who just tore it apart, I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I really appreciate your review. Can you tell me what it was about the book?" And the guy didn't have the guts to get back to me. And I'm like, if you're going to trash something, at least stand behind while you're trashing it, because at least I'm in a nice way saying, I would love to know what you didn't like about it.
Right.
Anyhow, so that's a whole other conversation for lack of spine, but that's all right.
Well, in your and before we run off and before we go, I know you have a very curious sensibility and in regards to that. So you ask a lot of questions, and that's obvious because you've asked me a lot of questions. Yeah. And you did your podcast, and so you are very inquisitive. So I want to ask you if there's a question you wish people would ask you and they never do.
Wow. Is there a question? I'm obviously really trying to think about this. I think it's a great question, and it may show my lack of insight in myself. I think if it would be great if someone was curious about how I balance the fear of failure because of my family instead of the fear of failure in lieu of my family. Oh. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's where it all starts, right?
Yeah. So,
well, then another conversation.
Yes.
We'll do this again.
I would love to. I love chatting. I mean, I chatted at you more than with you. I like next time maybe we could do it with each other. Because you and I had a great conversation prior, back and forth.
Yes, I enjoyed that. Well, next time we'll do that.
Yes. Thank you so much, Savannah, for having me. I really appreciate your time and energy and willingness to let me be a guest on the show.
Oh, and right back at you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I feel like that was just the tip of the iceberg with James. If you'd like to find out more about his book, The Crucible's Gift, or this podcast or DMG, check out the show notes. And if there's a topic you'd like us to discuss or somebody you'd like us to interview, just let us know. And once again, thank you so much for checking out DMG's Bootstraps and Business. If you get a chance, be sure and subscribe.